of making rubber molds and then making resin castings. And then we'll do some expanding foams, and we'll get into some coating materials and sculpting epoxies for like themed environment stuff. And so questions are great, you know, along the way, but hopefully we'll cover enough for everybody to be interested. Is there anything specifically that y'all were interested in seeing that you know of?
I don't know about specifically, but if you could talk a little bit about Reynolds and the different uses and projects, I think that'd be great.
Okay.
But yeah, for everyone that's here, this is Phil from Reynolds Advanced Materials, and he's going to do a little demo for us today. So if you want to introduce yourself and the company, that'd be great. We can get started.
Okay. So yeah, my name's Phil Clark with Reynolds Advanced Materials. We are a distributor of silicone rubbers, polyurethane rubbers, casting resins, epoxies, made for mold making and casting primarily, but we also, it's also used for sculpting in and of itself, pretty much anything that involves making something. We are owned by Smooth On, whose materials we're going to be mostly demonstrating. They have been in business since 1893. Reynolds has been a distributor for them since the 60s, and they bought Reynolds in the 90s and have opened up a bunch of other Reynolds around the country. And so we're kind of spread out evenly. I think there's about 12 stores, but we were the first one here in Dallas. So today we'll go ahead and get started by talking about mold making and casting, like what is a mold, and the types of different molds, and then we will get into kind of the different processes, get an idea of how, which way you might need to go for a project, or even if you need to make a mold at all, and because we'll be doing some themed environment, we're going to be adding some to this tree, you know, fake tree over here to help kind of finish that off, which really isn't necessarily making a mold. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. And if y'all have any questions while we're doing this, please feel free to ask so we can, you know, maybe make it a little livelier. All right. So let's first talk about what is a mold and what is a casting, just to clarify. So a mold is the negative impression of a positive casting or original model, right? So the casting would be what comes out of the mold. People often would use those words interchangeably, and it can get really confusing based on what industry you're dealing with. But for clarity and for what we're dealing with today, mold is the negative and a casting is a positive. So there's different ways of making molds. We're primarily going to be focusing on making molds with silicone rubber and then casting solid urethane plastic parts in it. What we're going to start with is what we call a block mold, which is essentially what this is. This is a block of rubber that we stick our object down, build a wall around it, and pour that rubber over the top. Pretty simple. What it comes down to is figuring out the best mold wall material to pull this off. So let's talk about a couple of those. Quick. I'm going to switch cameras to a top-down view here, so y'all should be able to see a little bit better. So what we've got here are what we call L boards. L boards, if you ever take a ceramics class, they will make plaster molds using L boards like this. These are literally an L-shaped board. You can see L-shaped board that clamp together to create various resizable boxes. And this is a very efficient way to make a mold for something that is square or rectangular, or something that is a whole bunch of something lined up for making something what we would call a gang mold, right? It's like the whole same piece, it's repeated over and over and over again. But you can see it would be a lot less efficient to make a mold of something like the state of Texas with these L boards. So people fixate on L boards, think that that's what they have to make a mold, but it's really not a great idea for something irregular shaped. So you can imagine if you built a square box around the state of Texas here, that you're going to waste a lot of material up in the corners and down here and et cetera. So what we would use instead is an oil-based clay to make a wall that fits more closely around our object. Does that make sense to everybody? The same thing kind of going on here with the mold of the kryptonite. You can see we've made a mold here that is round with clay that conforms much more closely and saves material. Another example showing the original mold, the first mold that was made with L boards. And you can see there is a ton of rubber being wasted in the corners of this mold. So there's probably $30 to $40 worth of rubber in this mold that doesn't need to be there for it to work correctly. Does that make sense? So it's all about figuring out the best way, the most efficient way to make that given mold. So let's go ahead and talk about other options. You might have something that's round, circular, and you can glue it down and put a wall of clay, or you could put a wall of using a bottom of a mixing container. So if you had like a small round object, you could cut this container a little shorter, stick it down to the bottom on the inside, and that's your mold wall. Just about anything that will hold liquid will work as a mold container. But let's go ahead and do a clay layup here with some clay mold walls, okay? So the first step in the process of making a mold is determining what that original model was made out of. So in this case, we've got a hard resin casting, kind of tended to look like it was made out of clay. But a common thing would be to, use clay to make a sculpture, whatever thing, to sculpt an object that is your original model. This is generally the hardest part of the process, is coming up with an original model. That's the thing we can't terribly help you with. You need to, if you want to make a mold, you need something to make a mold of. Depending on what it is, you may need release agents or sealers to address that. So something solid and non-porous like this chunk of resin duck is totally fine. I can just secure this down, build a wall, and we'll pour a mold. It's real easy. If this were made out of concrete or plaster or wood or natural stone, bone, anything that will absorb water will absorb rubber. And those things have to have a sealing agent applied to it. Lots of different options there, different choices for different projects. They can eat up a half an hour talking about just sealers. If you're not sure, please, call us, email us, ask us. We're happy to answer any questions you have about that. All right. So that said, we're going to go ahead and secure our duck model here down really quick. I'm just going to use a little bit of this Sculptek Soft as our oil-based sulfur-free clay, right? So this is a non-hardening, reusable modeling clay. So it doesn't dry out. Once you open up, it pretty much lasts forever, and it is reusable over and over again. And it's kind of sticky a little bit, not crazy sticky, but just enough that what we can do is make a little ring around the bottom of our model here. And then mash it down where we want it to be, just like that. And now it is perfectly secure. It's not going to go anywhere. But again, this is a solid chunk of plastic. If you have a model that is wood, or a model that is hollow plastic, or a model, for example, that is a hollow infill 3D print, something like this, it's full of air and it's buoyant. So anything that floats in water would float in the rubber when you're making the mold. And so you would need to secure it with something more stable than a bit of clay. You might put a screw through the bottom of the mold board here to secure it down, or you might glue it down with hot glue or something really stable like that. Lots of different options. If you're not sure, ask us, call us, email us. We're happy to answer those sort of questions. And real quick, the mold board we're using, this is just a piece of melamine board. This stuff is reusable. Essentially, it's a plastic coated particle board. You can buy it at the hardware store. It makes relatively inexpensive reusable mold boards for these types of projects. Nothing sticks to it very well, and so you can scrape it clean and reuse it over and over again. All right, so we've mashed him down there, got him nice and sturdy. But if you'll notice, let me zoom in there a little bit just so you can see real quick. You'll notice there is a bunch of clay that's now oozed out of the bottom of that. And what we want to do is clean that up first. Essentially, when you make a mold, it's going to pick up exactly what you pour the rubber against. The question I get all the time from new people using these materials is, you know, I've got a model, it's got a lot of detail, it's got a lot of fine detail. You know, what material is going to pick up the most detail? It's got so much detail. Well, all of these rubbers pick up exactly what you pour them against. So if you've got a greasy fingerprint on your model, the mold rubber is going to pick up that greasy fingerprint, and then every single casting you make is going to also have that greasy fingerprint. That makes sense. And so what we're doing here is making sure to clean up the base of this where it is exactly how we want it to look before we make the mold. Now, this thing's not absolutely perfect because, again, this is just a demo. Let's zoom back out a little bit. That's too far. But it'll be good enough for now. We won't have that chunk of clay that's showing up on all of our castings. Now, let's talk about real quick another issue we need to address, and that is undercuts. So let's say we're going to be making a mold of this duck, and what we want to do is flip them upside down, and then imagine how material is going to flow from this open top up here into this negative shape in the space, and what's going to happen. So I guess everybody's muted, so I'm going to just go ahead and explain it. What's going to happen is you're going to pour that material in from up here, and it's going to flow down into the head here, and then in the beak, there's going to be, see where this beak turns back up? There's going to be an air bubble stuck here because the air that's in this mold has to be displaced by that resin. And if you don't give it an escape route, it's going to just stay in there and it won't fill with plastic. So what we're going to do is create a vent using, in this case, a coffee stir. We're just going to cut this down and stick it in place, and that will be our simple vent here. All right, so we've cut that maybe a hair too long. I'm going to cut it a little shorter. Just a hair shorter again. That'll work. All right, now I'm going to take some clay, mash a little bit in the end there, down there. Oh, sorry. Then we will secure that in place. Okay. Now you can see we have created that vent. So when we flip that upside down again, you can see we now have that escape channel over here. Sorry, these reversed. That escape channel where the air can come from the beak and come back out of the mold there. Okay. Now let's go ahead, and I've pre-made the clay wall here. Zoom out a little bit. Pre-made a wall of clay. We're going to go ahead and secure that down. And a general rule when you're making a mold, like a pour-over block mold like this, is to leave about a ½ inch of space around your model. So that's what we've roughly got, a ½ inch of space, and that's pretty close. And now we can just kind of push that down. But what we want to do is make sure that it's actually liquid tight. So we're going to seal around this edge here to make sure that everything is properly sealed. Now, we'll go ahead and take some clay that I've rolled out ahead of time just to save some time here for us all. And I'm gonna push that down around the edge, kind of like you're caulking a window or a bathtub or something. We should be liquid tight now. All right, you'll see what we've done there. That should keep the rubber from flowing underneath the clay and getting out and making a big mess. Now, next thing we want to go ahead and do is put some release agent on. Now, the rubber we're using today, silicone rubber, doesn't actually stick to resin or clay like this. It won't bond to it. But if you were going to be making a mold with polyurethane rubbers, which are much slower curing, so we don't usually demo them, or if you were going to be pouring a silicone mold against something like glass or glazed fired ceramic, basically anything with a high silica content, silicone, you know, silica is in there, silicone can stick to it in those situations, so it would need a release agent then. So I'm going to go ahead and show the proper way to apply mold release. So there's our inside of our mold a little bit there. I'm going to go ahead and shake up. This is a material called Ease Release 200. This is essentially the go-to mold release that you're most likely going to want to use for most things. All right, so there's another can you might see if in a mold shop. It's called Universal Mold Release. It's the blue can. That is actually silicone oil, so it works really good for everything except for silicone, in which case it can act like a bonding primer. So this stuff should really be called Universal Mold Release, but it's too late to change the name without confusing people even more. This will work for pretty much everything. So I've shaken the can up, and what I'm going to do is spray it into all the nooks and crannies there. And then I'm going to get a brush, and I'm going to spray it or brush it into all the details. And then we're going to spray it again. All right. Okay, so that mold is ready to pour rubber in. Well, in about 10 minutes or so. What you see right there, that shiny, oily sheen, that's what proper release agent looks like. If there's puddles or pools of release agent, that's going to cause a problem. That those puddles of liquid release are going to inhibit the cure of the silicone, and your rubber is going to be all sticky and gooey where it's touching it. You're going to have a problem. Also, if you were to spray this right now and then immediately pour the rubber over it, you're probably going to have a sticky mold surface because you need to give some time for the propellants in the aerosol can to evaporate away before you pour the rubber. But by the time we've mixed our material together and are ready to pour, we should have had plenty of time and won't have any issues. All right, so let's zoom out again. I'm going to go ahead and put on some gloves now. We're going to open up a kit of Moldstar 16 Fast. I'm not aware of a name for the duck. You're welcome to try and give it one if you like. This is what a gallon kit of rubber looks like. Now, this is probably a lot more than, you know, what you would need for a small project like that duck. Well, it's definitely a lot more than you need. But I want to show you kind of different sizes of containers throughout today's demos, just so you can kind of see what is out there. When you open a kit like this, there's going to be a couple things. There's going to be two documents. Well, one is, advertisement, which we can just toss, but the other thing that's going to be in here, there's two things that are really important. One is a safety data sheet. And then a little that. A safety data sheet is basically going to tell you all the health and safety information about that particular product. Most shops and workspaces and classrooms have a that are using chemistry like this are going to have an area or a binder somewhere that you need to file this away. But this is going to tell you things like what to do if you get it on your skin, what to do if you inhale it, or if you drink it. Don't drink these materials, by the way. They're pretty harmless, but if you ingest them, it's going to be bad. Don't do that. But pretty common sense stuff, but it's going to tell you all those things you need to know. All right, no, so don't throw it away. The other thing that's going to be in here is the technical data sheet. Sounds ominous and daunting, but really this is just the instructions for the material that you're using. It's going to tell you things like the pot life, the cure time, the hardness, the mix ratio, what sorts of mold release you can or can't use with it, what types of materials you can or can't apply it to or cast into it. All these important questions, the things that people call us all day, every day to ask, a lot of that stuff is on here. We don't mind answering questions, but if we're not available, it's not business hours, read over the tech sheet. Also, read this before you start using any material. If you get a new product, new material, you're not familiar with it, read over this. It's going to be important information that you need to know. Okay, so don't throw it away. Save it, study it, cherish it. All right, that side. Let's go ahead and open our kit's material here. So MoldStar 16 Fast. This is the MoldStar series is a 1-to-1 mix platinum pure silicone. So it's really easy to work with. You mix 1 part A to 1 part B, equal parts by volume. Some people say 50-50. Real simple to use. This one happens to be very fast curing. So it has what we call a 6-minute hot life. That's 6 minutes to get the material mixed and poured before it sets up and stops being usable material. And then it's fully cured in 30 minutes and you can demold it and start using that mold in 30 minutes. Not practical for everybody, but for demos it's great, or for small projects where you need a mold really quickly, it is ideal. We obviously have much slower options that are more feasible for big projects and things like that. So the next thing we're going to do is open these buckets. So these gallon buckets are sealed with the factory, and lids are extremely difficult to pull off unless you read the directions where it says cut slots right there, and get a knife, a sharp blade, and cut those slots. Go ahead and do that real quick. If you've got any questions? All right. Bucket is cut and open, and it will be much easier to pry those sections of the lid open and open this up. Now, you may notice that on both of these containers, there is a lovely bright orange sticker that says a couple things. Store and use at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That's important because the silicone especially is sensitive to temperature. If you store it somewhere hot, you're going to ruin the shelf life of the material. The other thing that's really important, though, that's way more important, is the stir well before using. This is not a polite suggestion. This is an absolute requirement for these materials to work correctly. Basically, if you've ever seen oil and water in a wave jar and you shake it up and set it back on your desk or your shelf, and the oil and the water separate and stratify in the containers. Essentially, that's what happens in these buckets. There's different materials in each side, different chemicals that then separate. As soon as they're made and mixed and blended together, but you put them in a bucket, you let them sit for a few days or weeks, and they're going to start to separate. And if you don't pre-mix all the material in each side first, you're basically pulling the oil off the top and not getting the water, in the wave jar analogy here, and you're not getting the correct ratio of chemicals in each bucket, and so the material won't cure correctly, and you're going to call me very upset saying that there's something wrong with the material must be bad, and I'm going to walk back through all the big steps you did, and you're going to say, oh, well, no, I didn't know I was supposed to pre-mix it because you didn't read the bright orange sticker. All right, so very, very important. I can't stress that enough. Almost the vast majority of the problems people have where they think there's something wrong with the material, it's that they did not read the directions, they didn't pre-mix it. We're going to open up that container there, and inside here you can see it's a nondescript white liquid. And there's a little bit of weird coloration stuff going on. You can see a little bit of streaks there. What we want to go ahead and do is get in here and scrape the sides and the bottom of the container with a fresh, clean paint stick, stir stick, and get it nice and well blended together. So we don't see any major streaks of color or anything. This is going to apply to all of our materials. Pre-mixing like this, it's going to be different for each material, obviously, but that's the general idea. Anybody have any questions while we're pre-mixing here? Pancake batter. Yeah, it's pretty similar. It's a little thinner. Different rubbers are going to have different thicknesses. The Mold Star series is nice in that it's relatively low viscosity and flows pretty easily and mixes pretty easily. We also have the Mold Max series, which are 10 cure silicones, which is a different type of silicone chemistry. And those are usually mixed 10 to 1 by weight. A kit this size, a 2-gallon kit, is for the Mold Star is $185, I believe, $185. It's not dirt cheap or anything, but for the right projects, it is the ideal material. Of course, for smaller size projects and things like that, these materials do come in smaller containers. It's a different product, but same size, which is 2 pints of material in here, which we'll crack some of these open later. And these are usually about $30 depending on the material. All right, so that part A looks pretty good. Go ahead and dispense some of that into a measuring cup. So I want to get a bucket here, a measuring cup, and we're going to be pouring both the big L-board mold and our duck mold at the same time. So I'm going to mix a fair bit of this silicone just so y'all can see what it looks like to mix a large batch of it. And I'm going to pour to, let's see here. I'm just going to estimate. I'm going to pour to 60 ounces. Just those measurements are on my side so I can see them. And you're going to notice too, when I've done that, all that stuff dripping on the side of the bucket. This is really important to take the time now to wipe that material off with a clean paper towel, and so that you're not letting it just drip all over your surface area. So stuff like silicone rubber does not dry or set up on its own. So that liquid is just going to keep dripping, keep dripping. It's never really going to dry up. All right, so that's our part A. We'll put that up there, and we're going to go ahead and crack open our part B and pre-mix it as well. So just like before, we're going to get in here with a clean, this is a different clean, fresh stir stick, by the way. It's probably common sense for most folks, but if you don't say it, somebody will, not think of it. And you don't want to use the same stick you mix the A with, because these are going to chemically react with each other. So if you contaminate with the other stick, you're going to ruin the whole part B by partially curing and getting these clumps of weird, nasty stuff. So fresh, clean stick. I'm going to get in here and scrape the sides and the bottom of the bucket. Make sure you get it all nice and well blended together. The cured, if you have too much material and you're trying to dispose of it, or stuff left in the buckets and you just want to get rid of it, is just try to catalyze as much of it, like mix as much A and B together as well as you can, and it's fine to go into a landfill. It's not really recyclable material, but it is not toxic or anything like that. Material left in the cups is generally easily cleaned with alcohol or things like that, or other solvents. But trying to catalyze as much as possible is the ideal, both rather than just dumping liquid in the trash. All right, so our part B looks pretty good. go ahead and repeat our volume here. So we're going to pour the same 60-ounce line in this separate container. And again, we're going to go ahead and clean up those drips now, rather than letting them make a mess in our workspace. All right, so we'll go ahead and put these A and B containers out of the way. Yes, you can reuse the containers if you clean them out. The cured material peels out of the buckets pretty easily, and so that's nice. But the individual A and B buckets, you're going to want to use some alcohol. This is probably the best thing to wipe them out with. Mineral spirits will work as well. But mineral spirits are going to leave a residue behind, because mineral spirits don't evaporate very quickly, and so you may still want to come back with alcohol again and make sure they're really clean. You don't want to have like solvent left in the buckets afterwards that's going to contaminate a future batch. If that makes sense. That's why alcohol is nice, because while it doesn't cut the material as well, it doesn't leave residue behind of its own. It evaporates so quickly, so that's really make sure the bucket's nice and clean there. And so we've got a gallon bucket that we're going to go ahead and combine our materials in. I'm going to go ahead and pour the part B in first. That. Scrape the sides, try to get as much of it out of a measuring container as possible. Common question, is if you've got a big mixing bucket like this, it's got measuring lines on it, why aren't we just measuring out the material in the same bucket? And the answer to that is hot life, right? So as soon as those two materials touch each other, our clock is ticking. So let's say you pour to the 60-ounce line in the big bucket, and you're trying to pour to the 120-ounce line with your part A, but you overshoot it. You got too much material in there now. You weren't careful, and now you've got to get the right amount of part A in there to balance it all out. And that's really hard to figure out on the fly, and the clock's ticking, and you run out of time before stuff starts to kick off on you before you get it mixed and poured, especially with a fast rubber like this. So that's why we would recommend, especially for one-to-one mixes, to dispense them separately and then combine them into a bigger container. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and add our part A, and our clock then starts ticking. Try to scrape as much out of this as we can. There is always going to be a little bit of stuff left in the buckets, especially when you're using a fast material. You don't want to spend half your pot life trying to get every drop out of the bucket, and then again have the material set up before you can get it mixed and poured. All right, so there's always going to be a little bit left, so don't freak out about that. It's just kind of part of the process. All right, so now we go ahead and get in here and start mixing and blending the two components together. So you can see the Mold Star has this nice, one side's white, one side's blue, or another color, depending on which series, which one it is. And that gives you a nice indication to see how well you mix that material. When you still see streaks, you need to keep mixing. Not all silicones are going to have that. So we also have material like our Dragon Skin or Sorta Clear silicones that are either translucent white or semi-clear, sort of transparent, and you will not see any, both the A and the B look exactly the same. So you will not see streaks of any kind when you're mixing it. So you need to rely on really good mixing technique. And that involves scraping the sides and the bottom of the container very, very thoroughly when you're mixing it to make sure that you get all of that stuff blended in properly. All right, so it's looking pretty good, but what we recommend doing, especially with rubbers when you're mixing them, is a double mix and pour technique. So now I'm going to take another clean mixing bucket, and we're going to dump that first container into that clean, fresh bucket. What this is going to do is the stuff that we scrape off the sides into the center of that new bucket will now get into the center and we'll be able to properly blend it in completely. Just a sec, I gotta block the camera so I can see what I'm doing real quick. Let me get all that out of there. You'll notice I'm scraping the stick with the lip of the pour bucket rather than onto the side of the new bucket, which we just put the partially mixed material on the side, not where we want it. All right. Now you'll see there's these little streaks up in here that those can be problematic if you're pouring all your material into a mold and you need every drop out of that mold. And you're scraping the drops out of that bucket, the sides of that bucket to make sure that mold is totally filled up. Then you got all these streaks of partially mixed material on the backside of your mold, and that's going to be, either just a sticky patch if it's minor, or if you have it bad enough, it can be a chunk of improperly mixed material that settles down on the surface of your mold, and then you've got an unusable mold. So the double mix and pour technique just really helps to avoid those sort of simple mistakes and make sure, give you kind of an insurance policy to make sure that it's all properly blended together. And it can kind of look like there's still streaks in this, but really that's just kind of the material, kind of as you blend it, it kind of leaves these shadows, but it's fully mixed and blended at this point, okay? So let's go ahead and take our two molds. Go ahead and pour our duck mold first. Aim right there. What we're gonna do is aim our container, zoom out just a hair, and pour in the low spot of the mold. All right, and pour it in a relatively long, thin stream. And what that's going to do is help stretch the rubber out and pop any bubbles that might be in the mix. It doesn't guarantee no bubbles in your mixture, but it will help reduce the amount of bubbles. Also, pouring slowly like this, you can see the material seeps around the model and up and over it, which helps push air bubbles over the model and away from the surface, rather than if you slather it all over the top like that, you're going to end up trapping more air bubbles on the surface as more rubber pushes them back down against it. So this letting it self-level and come around the object is very important to get a good quality mold. Go ahead and speed this up just a bit, just because we've got a limited pot life with this rubber. We want to go ahead and get it poured into both molds. Now it is in. So we'll go ahead and move that guy out of the way. And let's go ahead and pour our Egyptian plaque here. So we're going to aim for this corner here, right there. And I'm going to do the same thing, pouring a long thin stream. Let the material flow and seek its own level. Some people get real crazy about this process and will put their mold box on the floor and they'll pour the rubber from up on a ladder and to stretch it as much as possible. It's generally overkill. It's not really doing that much extra if you try that, and it can also honestly just make a big mess. But it is good practice to do this long, slow pour. Okay. You may notice in the corners of this mold box where I've sealed up the edges with clay to make sure it's liquid tight. So that's one of the things about using L boards. You still need some clay to seal up your mold box either way. So again, for those of you who came in late, the L boards like this are great for square models or rectangular models or gang molds of a whole bunch of objects, the same object lined up in the same mold, something like that. but it's not necessarily ideal for a regular shaped part. That's because we're getting low on pot life. Let me go ahead and get this material forward. Scrape out some excess here. All right, go there. Now, let's go ahead and slide that out of the way. Slide our duck mold out of the way. In about 30 minutes, we'll be able to pop those guys open and start working with them. In the meantime, let's talk about other mold types, right? So the next thing we're going to do is make a press-on mold. We need some fresh gloves. Press-on mold is like what it sounds. It's mixing what a silicone putty together and pressing them onto something to make something like these texture pads here. So this is a like a metal grate texture, and this is a bark texture. We've got some stone ones I'll show you all here in a minute as well. I want to show you kind of how this process works and kind of the pros and cons of it and when you might or might not use a process like this. So just for simplicity's sake, so I didn't have to follow a stump in here or something like that, I've got a epoxy example of a bark texture here. Zoom in a little bit for you. You can see the bark there, and what we're going to do is mix up some silicone putty and make a press mold of this that we'll then use later in the demo session to apply to our tree armature, some epoxy plate. So for this, we're going to use Equinox 38, which is a 2-part silicone putty. This is all mirrored. The 38 is the medium speed of this family. We have a 35, 38, and a 40. The 40 is the slow. You've got 30 minutes to get mixed and applied, and it's cured in about 6 hours. So if you're doing a big texture stamp, the 40 is a really good way to go. The 38 here is what we call the medium speed, and it is a 5 minutes to get it mixed and applied. It's cured in 30 minutes. So it's good for this sort of medium-sized stuff when you have a little bit of wiggle room. It's pretty similar to the Moldstar 16, we just poured. And then the 38 is what I refer to as the make a mold before you get arrested speed. It's 30 seconds of pot life, well, a minute of pot life, but it feels like 30 seconds, and it's fully cured in 5 minutes. So you can't mix more than about a golf ball's amount of that material before it starts to set up on you. So you don't really want that 35 unless you desperately need to make a quick, small mold. So for this, we're going to go ahead and scoop out with one hand some part A. All right, so I've got kind of a ball of the part A. This is mixed equal parts by volume as well. And then with the other clean hand that's not contaminated with bits of part A, I'm going to dispense form a ball of part B. All right, and we're just kind of feeling for them to be equal size. Pretty close. And just for the size of this, and to make it a little firmer, let's mix up a little bit bigger batch here. Looking pretty good, pretty similar. Okay. Now to mix it, we're going to go ahead and just start kneading the two together really, really aggressively. Now the Equinox here is actually skin safe. I just have a silicone ring on that I will bond to. I don't want to ruin my silicone ring. And so I'm going to wear gloves in this situation. Equinox is also one of our food safe silicones, which we have several of those. We're not really getting into that today, but we do have that if that's something you're interested in. You see these streaks here that we're trying to, of white that are left in there, we're trying to make sure we get all that mixed out. So we're going to keep tearing at this and kind of kneading it together. You can also kind of do a rolling technique if you like, roll and twist, stuff like that. But generally, the goal is to get rid of any streaks of color in that mixture, make sure it's perfectly blended together. That can be really hard with the really fast curing stuff. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So we're gonna go ahead and roll it into a ball now, the tight ball. And we're gonna put it in the center of the area that we want to make a mold of, right? And then we're gonna push down and push away from that initial spot. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna help reduce the amount of air bubbles we trap on the surface of this mold, this texture stamp, right? So one of the inherent problems with making putty molds like this or press-on molds is air entrapment and creases and things like that. So if you've ever taken silly putty and pressed it onto something and peeled it off and looked at the negative of that, which you basically made a mold, it's just not a mold that's going to be useful or anything because it's going to melt back away. Essentially, what these containers are like 2 tubs of silly putty that mix together and react and harden up and become a permanent mold. So all those bubbles and creases and things you see in a silly putty like that are things that you're going to see in a mold made this way. So if you had a 3-dimensional sculpture with a lot of fine detail, and it was really important to get all that detail right, you're probably going to have a pretty bad mold if you do that. So I've got one here to show you what I'm talking about. Let's zoom in a little bit more. This is a mold of that Texan we were looking at earlier. And you can see on the surface there, you get these little bubbles and voids where you trap pockets of air in the, here it is, underneath the rubber against the surface. And you get that kind of these little micro bubbles as well. And you can see on the edges where they've added to it. If you're doing multiple batches of rubber, you're going to get seam lines and creases and stuff like that. So silicone putty is really great for texture stamps or very simple molds. Like it's used by a lot of frame repairs. Like you have an ornate picture frame, for example, like in a gallery. It's just really highly sculpted picture frame, and it gets chipped or damaged with plaster, or a crown molding that's damaged or something like that. A common practice is to take a putty like this and press it onto an area that is intact, that has the same repeating pattern, and then you would cast a rough plaster chunk of that and carve it away and resculpt it and carve it to fit in that missing area. But where in that situation, it's not as big a deal if you have a little void or bubble, because you can sand that off, clean it up, and it's sort of a temporary mold in that situation. That makes sense? But for what we're doing, we're making a texture stamp, and we'll be able to demold this in about 30 minutes and start using it later. But I'll show you some more examples of texture stamps. There's some more up closes here. This is one pressed against a piece of wood off of a wooden pallet, from the warehouse. You can see it's picked up all that grain texture. And what you can use that, we can then transfer that into a clay by pressing it onto the surface and get a sculpted, finish. Same sort of thing going on here. This is a rough stone from inside the building, the cement block. It'll give you a lot of texture. This is an actual pushed onto a sandstone piece outside, and we've been using this for pressing onto concrete and epoxy to make fake rocks and stuff like that. We'll show you some more of later. All right. So you can see it's a pretty thick piece, and it's even kind of worked from where it was wrapped around the shape of the rock. But you can bend and flex this, and you need to push that kind of texture and detail into stuff. And so these are going to be really useful for us later in this demo session when we start mixing up some epoxy clay to sculpt with. In the meantime, let's talk about the other type of mold, which is a brush-on mold. All right, so let's say you've got a larger sculpture, larger model. Say you have sculpted a life-size bust of Mozart. Back in just a pair here. Life-size model of this, right? Can you imagine building a box around a full-size human figure and pouring rubber in there? It's going to be extremely wasteful, extremely heavy. A life-size human bust like that, it's going to be 2 foot, 3 foot tall, 3 foot. You're going to be pouring like 5 gallons of rubber to make that mold. So it's going to cost you probably anywhere from $500 to $1,000 in rubber to make a mold like that. It's just not practical. It's not how you would make a mold of something big and three-dimensional. Like this is just a nice portable example we like to use for when I, when normal times when I would travel to colleges and do the silica demo. So what you're going to do instead is make a brush-on mold, or you brush on layers of rubber to build a skin that can be cut or peeled off of the model that can then be dropped back into, you can see this is the negative, invert the thing, right? That's notes are here. You can then drop that back into a rigid support shell to get some structure, or sometimes called a mother mold, but we'll call it a support shell today. And then we can secure that together and we have a usable mold that's ready to go there, right? We might put some bands on it, we might put bolt holes in it, but that's a brush-on mold. Now, I'm going to go over the steps in this process here just to get you an idea of how it works, so you have an understanding of it. A brush-on mold is one of those things where we're trading time for money, essentially. So, rather than pouring a big block of rubber, over something which is fast and easy, but it can be expensive, you're saving material by doing it this way, but at this cost of time. And so it would take us basically all day or several days to make a brush-on mold, depending on the project. So we'll go over the steps in that process here, rather than do the whole process, because it would be the entire demo. We're just going to go over that to get you an idea of how that works, so you can leave with just kind of an understanding of it, okay? All right, so we got an original model, just like before. It could be clay, it could be, plastic, it could be, carved foam, just about anything you can imagine. And all those same sort of things apply as what we were talking about earlier with the making the block mold or the duck. All right, so we got our original model. We would secure it down on a baseboard, and just like before, where we put a screw in it is what we've done here. A screw in through the bottom, as well as it being hot glued down, so it's really, really stable. For this demo setup, we've used Rebound 25, which is another one-to-one mixed platinum silicone, but it's thicker and designed to be used as a brush-on material, so it's less runny than the Mold Star. And it's designed to be strong in a thin section, like what we have in this brush-on mold over here. All right, so we're gonna mix our A and B together just like before, and then we're gonna take a disposable chip brush, because these materials are going to ruin the brush every single layer. All right, so disposable chip brushes shed really bad, so we want to go ahead and make sure that we pick all the bristles, loose bristles out of this thing ahead of time, so that we're not picking them off the surface of our model. And then you mix your material up, and you're going to dip it out, and you're going to stipple it onto the surface into all the details and nooks and crannies, right? And this is what we call making a print coat. And so the idea being that the layers should be so thin that if you have print or text on the original model, that you can read that print or text on that surface, right? So that's why we put it on so thin like that, so that we can see and make sure we're not trapping pockets of air, air bubbles, or we're not damaging the undercoat when we're applying it, all those sort of things, right? So it's the most crucial step in that layer, is to brush all that on and make sure that you don't trap any air bubbles, okay? And you also want to go ahead and make sure that you brush some down onto your workboard or your base area, or wherever area you can that's inconspicuous, so that you have a place to test to see if you're ready for your next layer. So the way you do that is you touch it, and when it's tacky, but it doesn't come off with your finger like chewing gum, you're ready for the next coat. So let's say we didn't have that area. We decided to go, okay, sorry. If you needed to go ahead and see if it's ready or not, you touch it on the nose here, and it pulls off with your finger. You now screwed up that layer. You pulled the material off the surface. Well, by doing that, you've created a void or a distortion in that spot, and your mold, mold's going to be ruined. If it's a print coat, you've done that, you might as well just rip the whole print coat off and start over, because you're never going to be able to blend that back down. So that's why having this area down here to test that is very important, okay? So you don't damage that in that process. I'm going to push these kind of to the side here, or even back a little bit. All right. Now, the next layer is what we refer to as a tint coat. So this is the same Rebound 25 silicone, but we have added some silicone pigment to it to alternate colors between layers. Anybody ever painted a white wall with white paint before? And as you lose track of what you cover and what you haven't, and it starts to dry, you will miss the spots over and over again. And the same sort of thing applies here. If you're applying this, coral color over that coral color repeatedly, it's hard to see what you covered and what you haven't. So you can miss a spot over and over again. And if you miss that same spot multiple times, you're going to end up with a really paper thin area of the mold. And that's going to be a weak spot for the mold rubber. It's going to want to tear right there. You might not even get it off of the original model without it tearing. So pigmenting every other layer is not absolutely necessary. It's just a really useful tip to make sure that you get even coverage and you build up the mold properly. We're building it up the thickness in several layers. Does that make sense? All right, so, and it is silicone specific pigment. This is Silk Pig Blue we put in just because it contrasts well, but you can use any color you want. You just need a pigment that is designed for silicone. You can't just put food coloring or something like that if it's going to inhibit the cure of the rubber. Right? Okay, and again, when it's tacky but doesn't come off with your finger like chewing gum, you're ready for that next coat. And it's about, with a rebound, it's about